Quick intro of Matt Oppenheimer, CEO of Remitly, digital financial services provider based in Seattle. Matt co-founded Remitly in 2011, and today the company serves millions of customers around the world with its digitally native cross-border payments app. With a global footprint spanning more than 170 countries, and I'd like to know how many of those countries you've actually visited, Matt. Remitly is on a mission to revolutionize international payments and transform the lives of millions of customers with trusted financial services products that meet their cross-border needs. Matt Oppenheimer, welcome. So good to see you.
Thanks, Edward. Thanks for having me. And I was just putting in chat, huge thanks to Brianna for such a kind intro, and thank you for all that you've taught me. The answer to your first question is I've been to 100 countries, but not 170.
All right. Well, we got some catching up to do, I guess. Well, Matt, I thought I would just give everyone a kind of an idea of the pastures we're going to graze through this afternoon in our chat. I think first we want to talk a little bit about like, how do you manage yourself as a CEO and founder with all the pressure and everything that goes on? Would love to learn a little bit more about like how you take care of yourself. We'll also talk about how you manage this incredible team that Brianna's already told us about for optimal performance. And then the big topic of the day, which you really kind of lit up when we were first doing our briefing call on this, board management. It sounds like you've got a lot of experience managing and building and optimizing boards. I think a lot of founders on the call and even investors on the call would love to know, like, what are your secrets? How can we dig into those? And then we've got a couple fun questions there at the end. All right. So let's just dive in. Matt, would love to know what, if any, unconventional self-care techniques you have as a founder and CEO.
It's a great question. It's such an honor to be here, and I'm sure I could learn equal amount from those listening as we're going through this. Unconventional self-care techniques. The unconventional part is the part that I'm reflecting on. So some of these may be conventional. We were talking about before this started, but I'm an avid runner, and just, exercising is a key component. But I do think that how I've weaved that into my life is perhaps unconventional. I run into the office every morning. That's my morning commute. And
run to the office every day.
Yeah, every day that I'm not. Yeah, there's some exceptions.
Every day you're going to the office. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, and I have a little like running backpack, and I've got a whole system set up where I have like shoes in the office, but then I put all the lightweight stuff in my bag. And then I've got a computer at home in the office, and everything syncs to the cloud. So that's one maybe unconventional.
So how does that work? Do you keep like many changes of clothes at the office, or do you run in with the clothes you're going to put on, or you just like stay sweaty all day?
Yeah, so I bring my clothes and there's a shower downstairs, or I go to a gym that's a few blocks away, but I bring all my basically light clothes, everything except my shoes. I just throw in this tiny little running backpack. Now my clothes are usually wrinkled. That's a downside. And then the system gets messed up when I have to go to like an evening event, because then I'm like, do I wear my tennis shoes? And earlier in my journey, I was like, oh, I got to look cool and I got to not wear tennis shoes. Now I'm like, I'm just wearing tennis shoes. Who cares?
Yeah.
I have like a few pairs of like nice shoes in the office. Everything else in my bag. Got the whole system set up. So that's probably the most unconventional. I do a lot of other mindfulness, meditation. I'm actually teaching my daughter a little bit about meditating, and she's teaching me a lot about being present and about life. Those are all probably more conventional. What else? Yeah, those are the running is probably the most unconventional.
I love that. I think that's pretty unconventional. That definitely counts. Running into the office, showering, bringing your stuff. And in terms of like wearing tennis shoes out to like events, it's almost like you get to a point in your career where you've earned that, like you have to like impress people somewhere early in the middle of your career, and then the like ability to give 0 Fs about your shoe wear. Amazing. So I think I'd love to hear a little bit about how you manage stress. Like, what are the things that keep you up at night at Remitly, and how do you take care of yourself from a stress management perspective?
Yeah. The things that keep me up at night are all people related, but I think that that's also just because of who I am and what I care about. Like I gravitate more towards people, culturing, hiring and firing the right team, much more than like, hey, how do I solve this specific problem? If I have the right people around me, then they will solve the right problems. That being said, I think a lot of founders, like there's a similar, kind of brilliance in their maniacal focus around whether or not it's solving a problem or a product or people. For me, it's people. So that's what keeps me up at night. The
Yeah.
things I do from a stress management perspective, I would say, like, there's the physical part, which I've talked about. There's an element of surrounding myself with people that give me good advice and that I can talk to. Sometimes that's coaching. Sometimes, like, I'm pretty open about my mental health journey. Like, I've seen therapists throughout my life. My mom's a therapist, so it's always been pretty normalized, but therapy has been hugely beneficial, just to, like, cognitive behavioral therapy, to kind of understand myself better.
I appreciate you being open about that. Like, I feel like we've kind of crossed the chasm now. It used to be that like
Yeah.
coaching and therapy were like the things you kept in the dark. And
Yeah.
now, at least in New York, we say like, we don't trust anyone who doesn't go to therapy,
Yeah.
right?
Totally. It has crossed the chasm, yeah, to where it's less, but it's something I've been open about for a long time, and open with some of my, like, mental health struggles in terms of, like, anxiety, depression, a couple of points in my life. And
Mhm.
so I think it's part of what makes me brilliant, but it's also taken, to your point about stress management, learning tools so I can leverage my brilliance, but also make sure it's not a source of misery. So I think that's been important. Um, those are a few things that come to mind, but recovery on weekends, like, I some of these things I'm going to say, and then they're going to be important reminders that I do again. But
Yeah.
I have not done this for a while. I used to do something called digital Sabbath, that I would just completely put my phone away and turn off any sort of data on my Apple Watch, so people could call or text. But I would do that for 24 hours from, like, sundown to sundown. I should get back into the rhythm of those kind of things, just to
Yeah.
really unplug. And the interesting thing for me is it's unplugging from work, but it's also unplugging from the, like, monotony of, like, this addiction of, like, social media, news, and other things. And so I should bring that ritual back. And when I was in some of this most stressful part of my, like, of the Remitly growth journey, I think I did more of those kind of things because I had
Yeah.
to.
Right. Absolutely. There's so much I could follow up on there in terms of like your gift and like how you kind of ritualize that with the digital Sabbath. But I do want to get into one thing we talked about on our briefing call was imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
you've been doing this for 13 years now, very
Mm-hmm.
successful, IPO'd,
Mm-hmm.
public company CEO. Tell me about your relationship with imposter syndrome over the years.
Yeah, definitely. Uh, Most palpable in the early days, and by early days, I mean the first 10 years, probably. And it's not to say it's not there anymore, but it was much more palpable. Like,
Yeah.
and it would come up in instances like when all boards, we'll get to board stuff in a minute. All boards should have executive session. It's part of what, they should do is proper governance, which means talking without management in the room at the end of a meeting. Um, and oftentimes those conversations kind of meander and they take a while because it's just a group of people chatting about whatever comes up. And so I remember this, like, in the early days, one kept going and going and going. And thank God for my co-founder. I turned to him and I was like, "Are they going to fire me?" And he was like, "No, they're not going to fire you. I don't know what they're talking about. Maybe, I don't know." But
Hmm.
yeah, there were moments like that. I'd say there are moments I've been able to hire and recruit a pretty senior team. And I started the business when I was in my late 20s, mid to late 20s. And so I think there was imposter syndrome of, like, who am I to, like, manage, um, folks that are a lot more experienced than I am. I think what I've learned is I have strengths. Oh, I also, this probably still sparks a little of the imposter syndrome. I
Mhm.
do an annual review and then I share my development plan with the entire company.
With the
Um,
entire company.
yeah, and I
Incredible.
used to share it via like a written. Now I do, like, a CEO Slack. There's this channel that has about 2,500 people on it. Most people in the company, Slack channel, where I'll give a verbal update. And I do focus on strengths because I think a lot of type A folks, like, skip over those, including myself. So I'm like, here's
Sure.
what I'm doubling down on that are strengths. But then I share, here are areas I got to grow and up my game. And so there's a little bit of imposter syndrome that might creep in then. But what I've learned, the reason that example came up is we all as humans have strengths, we have weaknesses, like, and I don't know if this will come up in today's, but, like, there's the right leader at the right time in the right place. I also don't think there's, like, one necessarily leadership style that's right in all scenarios.
Okay.
And I think I've gotten more comfortable that I've been fortunate that I think that the combination of being in the right place at the right time, the right leader for this company, for me, has leveraged my strengths. I would be like a very bad turnaround CEO. Do not make me a turnaround CEO. That would be a really, really hard thing if I went into like a private equity backed turnaround. And then I also have a bunch of weaknesses. My co-founder, so many people have complimented me in those. And just by knowing them, I think it's helped me work through the imposter syndrome because I'm like, can't be everything to everybody. And here's who I am, here's who I'm not. How do I hire and develop the areas I'm not? And there's a confidence that that has to come from, but there's also, it's kind of liberating. And I think it drives better business results.
Yeah, yeah. I really want to double click this idea that you share your development plan with everyone in the company. And I want to underscore how one, brave that is, and two, how important that is, because when the CEO is owning that he or she is not perfect and has a plan for growing and shares that with the team, everyone else in the organization gives themselves permission or has that permission from you to not be perfect, to learn from their mistakes and to grow. So thank you for doing that and for setting that example. Yeah. Let's I want to talk more about your team, but before I do that, speaking of vulnerable, I'd like to ask you to share with us what's one of the biggest mistakes you made early on in the business?
I mean, so many. I think that there's a bunch of decisions that we made that like we tried to build like our own messaging system that made no sense in hindsight. Like this was back in 2013, maybe. But the mistakes that stick with me are not those. The mistakes that stick with me, again, because of who I am, are all like people related. They're the hires I made that were wrong. There's the folks that grew out of like, there's somebody who might be critical for Series A to Series B, Series B to Series C, whatever letter you want to pick.
Yeah.
And stage, waiting too long to have the difficult conversation, and then the churn that caused our team and our customers, the team under them and customers. Related to that, I'd say, I can't prevent that from happening, but what I can prevent is a term called management debt. And what management debt is either because I didn't know I had a blind spot, like because our fill in the blank chief executive, had gaps that I didn't know what good looked like for where we were headed. Or because I didn't have the courage to be as direct and clear. I think I've gotten a lot more courage as the years have gone on. That's a big mistake. I need to own that. I can't change the companies grow and talent needs to change. I can grow that I, as their manager, had blind spots and didn't tell them continuously, or didn't have the courage and tell them continuously. And that was my mistake and failure. And it's happened multiple times. And I think that when that happens, I got to own that as a manager. Like I've failed that person as their manager. And so when you say areas I've failed, that's probably the one that comes to mind the most. The area, I mean, one, having courage is important as a manager, that like clear is kind, continuous tough feedback is important.
Clear is kind. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's one that you just grow as a manager. The other one, it's like, how do you see around blind spots of like, how do you know what whatever title, I don't want to pick out like a specific chief whatever, like it looks like 2 or 3 years if you're a first-time founder. And what I found there is, and I still do this, I do market mapping. I get to know what is the talent that might be out there. And then once I see that talent, one, I know, so I can give more clear feedback. Two, I often engage those individuals as advisors to the person in the role, so they have more of a growth trajectory. And three, sometimes it's been the scenario where like I get to know somebody that maybe we're a little too early for, but like 2 years down the road, one person that comes to mind I knew for 2 years, and then the right time came and we hired that person. So I think really looking externally and saying what talent is out there for where we're headed can help remove blind spots and help mitigate the mistake that I made.
Yeah. I also hear that you're normalizing the fact that not everybody is, well, not everybody's perfect, that people are the right executive for different points in the company's growth. Right. You're normalizing that everyone gets feedback. You're normalizing that everyone can have a mentor. Right. And again, this creates a lot of openness and curiosity for people, so they can say like, all right, maybe I'm not supposed to have all the answers. I'm supposed to know where I can find the answers. Right. It gives people a sense of agency, as opposed to clamming up and thinking they need to be perfect. And on that point, how do you think about holding seasoned executives accountable? Especially, how did you think about it early on when you were, as you said, younger? You were hiring people who had 10 more years experience than you. How do you hold them accountable? How do you raise the bar? and push the performance on the team?
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. I think that's honestly been a growth area for me to some extent because it takes a fair amount of process. I mean, on the value side, I can hold people accountable and I can talk about our Remitly cultural values. Now we've codified that. So it's not just like culture and values in some sort of vague way. I think I've been decent at holding people accountable to that as long as I've had the courage. On the goals side, what I've recognized is, and maybe this isn't true in the very early days. I think I was probably better at it in the early days. What I would do is I would say, here's the area, the objective we're trying to accomplish, and then I kind of co-create goals with them. And then how big the company was, how fast we were growing, there'd be a regular cadence of reviews because like you had to, an urgency, because if you didn't hit X or Y, like you weren't going to get the next financing, you were going to get the next, you name it. I think where I say that I have a growth area and the process side, and I really lean on my CTO at this point, who's phenomenal at this. There's a lot of process, like goal setting, regular cadence of reviews. Because if you don't have the right goals, and goal setting even sounds like an easy process. We put more rigor around that. If you set the right goals, then it's a lot easier to hold people accountable. It sounds like an obvious thing, but I think a lot of folks get to the accountability point and they realize that they haven't actually been clear on what the outcomes and goals that are the most important to achieve are. So yeah, it doesn't exactly answer your question, but it's been a growth area, especially on the setting clear goals and then having the right process and rhythm to drive that accountability.
Yeah. We talk a lot about helping the team understand what good looks like, right? It's like, really want to go accomplish this, but what do I want to see as the attributes of this, the quality of the execution? Who are the stakeholders I want to make sure you're involving in that, right? As opposed to go take that hill. I actually have a couple thoughts about how you should take that hill. And I can tell you exactly how to do it, but I'd like to make sure you take the hill to this level of quality. One of the topics we get in, we find a lot of. Oh, you want to double click on that?
One other thing that might be relevant to this that I don't know if it's the right framework. It's probably not, but for some reason it's been a mantra for me and advising other earlier stage entrepreneurs on the journey. Your job at the beginning is to do directly. You don't have much of a team. It's to do most things directly. Then you shift into this deciding. Like one of the things my co-founder is exceptionally good at is being right a lot. I'm average. I'm good at people.
Okay.
Some of the decisions he made were like critical. Like we were going far down the path of launching Mexico as an example as our second market. And we realized a bunch of things of why it was too early. We pivoted to India. This was in the early days. And he and only he could decide to like pivot to India. And he was right. And then we went back to Mexico a few years later and it's been enormously successful as well. The third, so it's do, decide, and then it's ultimately like set the right goals and hold folks accountable for the right outcomes.
Yeah.
And it's not like it's linear and it's not like it's okay, I'm like graduating this and graduating this across all areas. But the reason I mentioned it is because for folks in the growth journey, I think just being intentional about where are you doing, where are you deciding, and where are you delegating and holding accountability for outcomes and goals. Because without the intentionality, high performers that you're deciding for are going to get, or doing for, are going to get pissed off because they don't have enough rope. But folks who might be stretched, you may need to do and decide, and how to just be intentional in those areas, I think is super important, because otherwise it just happens intuitively and organically, and that can create a lot of confusion.
Yeah. It sounds a little bit like you're talking about situational leadership, which is a framework that basically came out of Harvard, and is basically every leader has to decide what are they going to direct people on, what are they going to fully delegate to people to like totally empower, and then in between, how are they going to coach and support people, right? So at every moment, everyone in your team is somewhere on that spectrum between I'm fully directing you and I'm fully delegating to you. On that topic, how do you discern which decisions get delegated? Is there a framework that you use? Is it a felt sense?
Yeah. Well, the first is as many as possible. Because again, know thyself. And I do not think this is true of most entrepreneurs, because I think you have to make critical decisions that determine one's success or not. So there's almost like a self-selection. Folks who are good at critical thinking, decision-making, kind of make it to that next level.
Yeah.
Me, I've surrounded myself with people that are very good at decision-making, but it's never been what like I'm that jazzed about. So the first is as few as possible, which I think is how you scale as a company. And then for the ones that I do make, It's around things like the strategy of the company. It's around key hires. It's around annual budgeting. It's around our vision. It's around our culture and cultural values. Those I can then zero in and spend a lot more time, energy, and intention around those. But even I, who doesn't love decision making, it's so interesting. You put something in front of me that I used to decide, 5 years ago, and I'm like so tempted. It's like, oh, let's problem solve and let's jump into this. So I think it is about letting go to the right people as the company continues to grow and just being intentional about it. And then the last thing I'll say is when I do make decisions, this is learned via a coach. We use something called the thinking environment, which and something specifically called rounds. So if there is a large decision, what you'll see in even our quarterly business reviews, what you'll see is there'll be a panel of 10 people, 10-ish, and each person will go around and share their thoughts, and they each get a certain amount of time of like a minute or two each. And this is just one tool in the broader concept of like what it means to truly and intently listen. I think most organizations are not very good at listening. For example, I interrupted you a minute ago, and I apologize for that. I was too excited.
No.
The thinking environment really helps me as CEO, though, to your point about how I make decisions. When I need to make a decision, I've heard from everybody around the table. And then sometimes I'll open it up for discussion. But just by listening and getting everybody's viewpoint, I think I come to better decisions for the decisions I have to make. And I don't just use this. The company uses it. We've trained our top 150 leaders on it because it's super powerful. Just listen and get the right input before making a call. And if you want to learn more about that, there's a book called The Promise That Changes Everything by Nancy Klein, which is all about listening. We won't talk as much about the thinking environment as it will about the amount of work and intentionality that goes into just very carefully listening.
Yeah. We talk a lot about that CEO should be seeking dissent. That one of the worst things you can have is, a team of yes people working for you. Do you use those rounds to promote seeking dissent? Do you learn a lot? Do people take the initiative to say, I actually disagree with everything the other 9 people have said so far? Do you find that happens?
Great point. That's something you taught me, is that bell curve chart that you showed us, which is around like, do you have like rabble rousers that are kind of like disruptive to the organization, or do you have just consensus builders that are afraid to speak up? I think it's about getting the right people around the table, and then we have values like constructively direct that we do reward. Like we want people to say, I disagree, and here's why. And I think that partially comes down to having like a team that lives that constructively direct value.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to shift us into talking about boards. I think people are wringing their hands, are really excited to learn about what does Matt Oppenheimer have to say about managing boards. And I'd love to just hear first, before the IPO, what was the most challenging part about managing your investors and your board?
Oh, first off, I don't know if there's a way of like doing the raised hand feature or just putting like board versus like investor versus founder or entrepreneur, but that'd be helpful. So if you can throw in the chat, like you can, folks can throw in the chat, like
if you're more on the founder side. Yeah.
Operator or investor, like would love, if you want to throw it in while I start answering the question, would love just to get a sense of where folks are coming from. The question was, what were some of the most frustrating moments? Is that right, Edward?
Challenging, but if you heard it as frustrating, we can talk about that too.
All right, I'll go with challenging first, but then we can go to frustrating. I think that some of it was around managing board size. I think is very hard to do. It takes a lot of intentionality and thought.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. That was actually one of the follow-up questions. So how do you think about managing size of a board?
Generally, the smaller the better, but the challenge is as folks are raising various rounds, then it often comes with the right to a board seat. But I think that directors and observers are kind of equivalent because they're folks in the room. So I think managing both the number of directors and observers around the table is important. And I think what a lot of, if I up level it slightly, and then it'll be a good segue into broader, more specific questions you have. I think what a lot of founders, well, I'll just talk about myself as opposed to broad founders. What I underappreciated in the early days is I have 2 jobs. I'm chair of the board and I am CEO. Two distinct jobs, very different. And I think a lot of the imposter syndrome that we talked about made it so I kind of had to manage my board in the early days because I didn't want their perception of me to be negative.
Right.
And there's some value in that.
You were managing their perception of you in addition to managing them.
Yeah, yeah,
Sure.
yeah. And I think that there's some of that that's just true, like for any CEO. So it's not to discount that, but then once you get past that element, there's a question of like, all right, well, if I'm chair of the board and I'm CEO, how do I create a high performing executive team and how to create a high performing board? Now, what falls out of that is like, do I have the right people around the table? And are there too many people? And the reason I say smaller is just because, we raise like through series E or F. Like if you have big ambitions, there's going to be multiple rounds. So starting smaller gives you more optionality to be able to continue to grow. When to bring in a lead independent, I can go into that. How to set agendas and structure the discussion in the right way. Part of creating a high performing team. How do you give feedback?
What do you mean by high performing board? What does a high performing board look like? What are the performance indicators, if we can, right? What should we be thinking about, looking for?
Yeah. First and foremost, and this is what I mean, ultimately it's to drive long-term like value in the company. What boards should be focused on is hiring and firing and developing the CEO, which is why it's awkward if you're the CEO and the chair a little bit, but that's why you need a strong lead independent director.
Yeah.
It's around setting the right budget, which I've got some very memorable moments of when our board like helped up our game there. It's about helping the CEO, empowering the CEO to have the right team, but helping network hire, see those blind spots around their team under them, and also thinking about succession planning of the CEO, because the more successors are, the higher performing the organization should be.
Yeah.
That's a board's job. Setting strategies, part of the board's job. Those are the things. And I would say our board, because of that, was not like a wallflower board. Like we also did like deep reviews individually and collectively as a board. And I can talk about that's rare for private companies. And
deep
one of the
reviews of individual board members, or they did a deep review of you?
I asked my board, actually, this is a fun thing. Once I started to graduate a little out of not graduate, but anyway, so reviews of me, the development plan I talked about, I ask our board to do a review every year. Sometimes I ask the board to hire a coach, but usually what I did is for the new investor that came in, I was like, and we raise like around every, call it 12 to 18 months. So for the new investor that came in and got a board seat, I said, welcome to the board. And I actually use this in the back of my mind before I selected if we want this person as investor. I'm like, would I want them to do my review?
Yeah.
And if the answer was no, then I was like, okay. But maybe we didn't have any options. Like, let's be real for entrepreneurs on the call. Sometimes you don't have multiple options, but like, we'll live with it. And for the answers when we did have multiple options and I didn't optimize just for like the price of the deal, I asked myself, would I want this person to do my review? So then they joined, and the first order of business was, welcome to the board. Like Ron, as an example, Brianna used to work for Stripes, and Ron Shaw was one of our directors for a lot of years. Superb director. And I was like, new person around the table, new perspective, needs to get to know me, and probably has some new feedback I haven't already heard. Congratulations, Ron. I'd love for you to do my review if you're up for it. It's not a congratulations. More like, please, Ron, do my review. But
it's more like hazing. It's a form of hazing of the new board members.
Yeah. And so, but it was such a great onboarding tool. And then it was a great way for them to get to know me to get to know them. So yes, I did reviews, but now back to your broader question, that spirit of everybody should have continuous improvement. We hired an external coach for this, but we did both board level review, and a board also has to grow. Like what a Series A board should do versus a public company board, very different.
Yeah.
And so board members have to grow. Both the composition should evolve, but also directors need to grow. And so what we did as well is every 2 or 3 years, for the last 10 years, we've done like we do a lightweight one. And then every 2 or 3 years, we do an in-depth board review, both collectively for us as a board, how we're doing, and then individually each director, any feedback of where they need to double down because they're adding a ton of value and where they might need to grow and change.
Yeah. Yeah. You said Ron was a superb board director. What made Ron so good?
I think he did all of those things that I mentioned in terms of where he focused his time and energy.
But superb is more than just doing them.
Yeah, and he
Yeah.
did it in a way. Two other things I'll say. I could speak for a long time about Ron and several of our directors, but I'd say a few other things Ron did. One is he was very empowering and clear on decision making, and so he might push, 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 and give feedback, which I like for my board. Like that's a mantra: push, push, push. They push. But then there's a line between management and board governance where
Yeah.
just the sentence at the end or the like spirit of it is like, here's my view. I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna push you, and then it's your call. Or this is
Mm.
actually a board call. But being clear on that, I think something Ron's great at.
Hmm.
Ron's also just incredibly smart. Like, and
Yeah.
that sounds like a throwaway, but I remember still the conference room we were sitting in when they were doing diligence. And, you know, when you're out raising capital, if you're an entrepreneur on this, like call the diligence process and courting process with investors is telling, right? It's like, wow,
Yeah.
how much am I learning from these conversations? How good are these questions? And I remember when Ron and the Stripes team were asking these questions, and I was like, I don't even care if you take capital from me. I'm just learning a ton from this conversation. And that is not always the case. And so his ability, what I call to kind of like ramp versus add value, like the ramp's so fast, and then he just would start adding value where others would just take a much longer ramp. And I think that is
Mhm.
partially because of his intellect and partially because of his experience. Those are a few examples. And then he surrounded, like Brianna was part of his team, who helped us with like C-level hires. So instead of having like a talent partner that was like in a consultative capacity, like we
Yeah.
turned over C-level searches to Brianna and team as opposed to doing those via a search firm. That saved us money, and it was a better outcome because of their network and because of like how they really rolled up their sleeves to help. So those are a few examples.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, we sometimes advise or coach investors, kind of partners from general partners down to like the new partners in a firm.
Yep.
And a question we often get from the younger investors, shall we say, is like, how do I take up a little bit more space in this room? How do I provide value right out of the gate
Yeah.
to the CEO when this is only like the second or third board position I've ever had? Like, what
Yeah.
advice do you have to those newer board members for one to distinguish themselves, two to, how do you debate with a very seasoned board member? You've got someone who's been on 100 boards over 30 years, and this is your second board
Hmm.
position. How do you
Yeah.
think about that?
It's a great question. My initial instinct is seek first to understand before trying to be understood.
Mhm.
Um,
So don't go in,
only
swing
get,
in big swings, try to impress everybody.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'd probably be intentional about it with the other directors, so I'm not perceived as like a more junior wallflower and saying, listen, my goal for the first X period, 6 months, year, whatever it is, you're going to hear me contribute, but you're going to hear me listen a lot. And you're going to hear me like really digest and absorb, because when I do start speaking up more, which I will, I'm going to have more context. And I really am excited to like listen and learn from that perspective. I think the second thing is to recognize a lot of the board work does not happen in the boardroom. And so it's
Yeah.
about establishing strong relationships with the other directors and with the CEO, especially, but potentially broader management, via the right one-on-ones and onboarding. It's knowing thyself. Like I could pick another director on Remitly's board, like Nigel Morris, and I could go through the areas that he added value. Some are very similar to Ron, but some are different. He's the founder of Capital One. He has an
Yeah.
amazing story. So know thyself where you can actually add value. Um, and then if I'm on a board with somebody who's been a director for like 20 years, and like I would use that as somebody to learn from. To the point about imposter syndrome is like, oh, how do I add value? Like where
Yeah.
where where a growth mindset's like part of establishing the relationship is that person probably wants to teach you how to be a great director, and you have to agree with their approach and everything they say.
Mm-hmm.
I'd use it as like a mentorship relationship, similar to how I did. So like this was, I mean, I'd been on nonprofits boards, but the Remitly board was this first large scale corporate board. And I brought on a lead independent that was phenomenal at board governance. And
Mm-hmm.
he would be my sounding board where I would go to him more in the CEO capacity, but you could do it as a director capacity to say, hey, for a series B, like this director's going here And for our stage, that feels a little bit too operational as opposed to like the right governance level. And 50-50 of the time, Philip, our lead independent, would be like, no, that's fair. He should be digging into that, or she should be digging into that. It's totally fair. 50% of the time, be like, yeah, you should push back on that because that does feel like it's a little too operational and not at a governance level. So having a sounding board like that, if I'm another new venture investor and I'm debating what altitude am I operating at, I'd use that 20-year veteran to like be a sounding board and get feedback and grow from
Right.
it.
Right. I mean, so two things I heard there. One is name the fact that everyone knows you're new, right?
Yeah.
It's okay to name it, to talk about it, say like, my intention here is to spend X amount of months listening and learning and figuring out how I can add the most value, because I know I'm going to be able to add value, but I want to figure that out first. And then the second thing is a lot of investors come in and say, like, how do I earn respect? I want them to respect me right out of the gate. And you know, what I've learned over the years is if you want to earn people's respect, you have to first respect them. Respect the experience in the room. You have to respect the fact that you don't know everything, that there's a lot of context you're going to have to come up on, right? I surf a lot. And when you go to a new break, you have to respect all the people who were in the water before you, all the people who may have been surfing there for 20 years before you. You have to figure out very quickly, right? And if you don't show respect to the locals, they're not going to show respect to you.
Yeah. It's a great point about respect and where it starts and how to gain respect is respecting others. Such a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get a little bit more operational. Like, how did you think about systematically communicating with investors in early days? How did you think about setting agendas for board meetings? How did you make that time really useful?
Yeah, it's funny because folks don't call investor relations until a company is public. But I think investor relations started when we were like, you know, did a seed round. And what I would do is at the right altitude, and that altitude has changed over the years, I would send, I think it was started monthly, that was too frequent, but then quarterly, you know, we'd have a quarterly board meeting. I'd kind of summarize, here's the updates, and I would send it to our, you know, much larger list of angel investors. And I kept doing that up until 6 months before we went public when we couldn't do it anymore. And now, obviously, as a public company, we have a whole IR cadence. But I think that in early stage companies, IR goes a long way. And I think it's overlooked by a lot of investors because, I mean, by a lot of operators because they're like, oh, I don't want the investors in my I don't want them like too involved operationally. The reality is, one, most of them don't want to be. Most of them don't want to be. It's different with directors, but most small investors don't really want to be. And two, investors can help. And if you engage them, kind of goes back to the respect point a little bit, then they're going to have more respect for you. And there, it also increases the likelihood of things like them participating in future rounds because you're bringing them along for the journey. So a quick, and I operationalized this later where like our legal team would, or our communications team, I think, started to help. I'd get the content, but then it would be like a MailChimp kind of thing that went out to, you know, a broader list because we acquired some companies along the way. They had investors. Those folks had no idea because they had joined the Remitly journey via a company we had acquired as very small investors, but they felt treated with respect. They helped. And I think it made them feel like, you know, much more like part of the Remitly journey.
Yeah, yeah. When you think about this quarterly board memo or investor memo, how long, what do you include in there?
I thought I was trying to pull one up, but I couldn't find one that was, let's see. I did look here. Beam it. Let's look. Let's show this one. I don't know.
You want to share your screen?
Yeah, let's see here.
So Beam It was the name of the company before Remitly.
Beam It was the name of the company before Remitly. And so this is an update in December 2011. So I've been doing the business 6 months at midnight. So apparently I needed to sleep more then. And this was like, you know, an update on folks we're hiring, like, you know, building a great team. This is like in the very, very early days. But yeah, it was just a quick update. And I think that it doesn't need to be long. It can also, the other thing I found is that there's quarterly updates, but then there's also like, hey, are you sharing big news? And do you want your investors to find out about the big news from the news? Or do you want them to find out about like the morning before you release it or the day before? So you can say, here's, you know, what we're doing. And then they feel part of the journey and get engaged. So it doesn't need to be long. That's an example.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just make a note of time. We've got about 15 minutes left, so we're going to open it up to questions from folks who have joined us here in the live studio audience. So if you do have questions for Matt, it can be about boards, it can be about marathons, it can be about whatever you want. Put those in the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat window. And while people are thinking about their questions, I wanted to ask you just a little bit about when you talk about managing the board,
Mhm.
right? What were those moments when you had like a pretty significant disagreement with the board, and how did you move through those moments?
Yeah. Um, there were many. Uh, there was one that I remember vividly where there was a budget that we put together that was kind of like a crap budget. Like it was crap because we were in this in-between phase where we could either go spend a bit more and be a little more aggressive and get to a much larger outcome, or we could batten down the hatches, grow, but like get to
Mhm.
profitability. And the plan that I proposed was like right down the middle. And it was like,
Okay.
it made no sense. And I remember vividly this conversation with one of our directors where he called me out on it. First, I think doing board pre-briefs is really important because you don't want that to happen in the board meeting because then it's hard not to
Yeah.
be like defensive. You're like, hey, you need a budget approved at the end of the day.
Sure.
And so this was in a coffee shop with one of the directors, and I went through that budget with every director. And then two, it's like, are you going into that with like, I just want to get this budget approved? Or are you going in with like, hey, I do actually want to get feedback? And the disagreement happened because I think if I'm honest, in that initial moment, I was a little defensive. I was like, and he was very direct. And so I needed to take that away, process it, get a few other directors' views, and then we came back with a plan that picked a path. And I think that's good board governance. It was a disagreement, but then once I kind of like recovered from the initial onslaught of this is a horrible budget, it
Yeah.
got to a better outcome.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like you learned a little something in that interaction. I'd love to ask you to share a story with us of something a board director did that was maybe surprising, out of character. They stepped outside their normal, I would say, let's say, job description, and to support you in a moment when things weren't going as you thought they would.
Yeah. Oh, lots of there are lots of examples of when things were not good. It's like, who did you actually call for a little bit of support when a fundraise was hard or when you didn't hit the numbers exactly and you had folks focus a little bit more on how can I support, like knowing when to push versus knowing when to like just support. So there are a lot
Yeah.
of examples along those lines. But the other example, this is actually a pretty selfless, I think, example of one of our directors is part of managing board size is each fundraising round, you should look at like, hey, is this the right board? Do they have the right skills for this next phase? And should I recalibrate the board to say, okay, this person's coming on, but this person's leaving? And there was one round where uh, this actually happened a couple times, and I think it was, I mean, super, super admirable for directors. And I think part of it's because of the trust, the dialogue, truly what's right for the company. But I
Yeah.
had a couple directors opt out and say, like, I love nothing more than being on this board. It's one of the highest performing boards. And what you need for the next phase is not me. And you need to manage board size.
Hmm.
I'll opt out. And it made it so, I mean, they still had a legal right to a board seat too. And that
Yeah.
to me was like supporting me in a hard time as opposed to me having to go to them and say, I think now's the time to rotate off the board. But there were a few of those examples that I've remembered for a long time.
Yeah, a little bit of wisdom there, right? And knowing when to step away
Yep.
as opposed to holding onto the board seat out of ego or out of
Yep.
obligation or anything else.
Yep.
To that end, one of our listeners has asked a question. Could you describe more in detail your preference to have truly independent board members that hold your feet to the fire versus well-intentioned members who will support the founder no matter what?
I think that other than I love the question, Stephen. I think other than the words no matter what,
Hmm.
I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think that the way that that my board has supported me, like support the founder, support me, has been by holding my feet to the fire
Yeah.
in a humble but very direct way. It's kind of like what I said about when I failed as a manager. Like directors are not doing a CEO a favor if they're not pushing and holding them to the fire and helping them see around corners. No matter what part, I know some venture firms are like, we'll just support the founder no matter what.
Mm-hmm. And a number of founders have gotten into trouble because of that, because
Yeah.
there was no accountability.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's the only part I'd say is like, no matter what, I think is hard because I think
Mhm.
corporations should have some sort of oversight around performance. Now it's hard because sometimes without the founder, the company will just fail. Like if it's a Series
Yeah.
A and Series B and you exit a founder prematurely or early, you can say you're going to bring in new management. It's just such a big reset. It's such a big challenge. Like the company may never be the same or be successful. So you want investors that I think appreciate and know the value a founder can add. But then I want investors that hold my feet to the fire.
Yeah. 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 We've got just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to pivot to a few more fun questions. And people
Great.
still have time to ask you a little bit more about managing and the team and the board. I'd love to hear about what's the most impactful book you've read or listened to in the last year? What'd you love about it?
Well, I was going to say, and I was just typing in Stephen to say thanks. Thanks for the great question kicking us off. And I'm glad some of what I've said has been helpful. What's been a book? I used to say the hard thing about hard things by Ben Horowitz, but that's so dated now.
Yeah.
I might circle back to the Promise That Changes Everything by Nancy Klein. That's been super valuable.
What about it?
I think most of us, and I don't like generalizations, so I'll talk about myself. I don't think I'm a very good listener, and I think it's helped me be a better listener. And really, it's a term that's thrown around, but I need to listen more to the viewpoints I totally disagree with.
Yeah.
And I think I've also used it to then teach the organization how to slow down and listen a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, having spent time with you and the team, either you've done an incredible amount of work on learning to listen because you're an exquisite listener now, or you're maybe a little hard on yourself.
It's I'm excitable like any entrepreneur, so I guess it probably depends on the forum and context.
Yeah.
So anyway,
I mean, that actually,
yeah,
that it brings up an interesting question that I skipped over earlier, but I think we can
yeah,
revisit here. You know, one of the core responsibilities of a CEO is to give away as much work as possible and to delegate decisions. How do you navigate those conversations where you see a decision going sideways, like you would do it really differently, and you need to zoom in? You need to go maybe like one or two layers down in the organization and change a little thing. Like, you know, Steve Jobs is infamous for doing this with like,
yeah,
you know, subtle changes in font and color and, you know, with
yeah,
design. I don't imagine you get that detailed
yeah.
with the product, but how do you have those conversations?
Yeah.
Because every CEO has to do it from time to time.
Yeah, I think it's probably um via one, how important is it?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
because just because I want to doesn't mean I should. So
Yeah.
is this a coaching moment based on their decision and output, or is this I'm going to jump in and do it? And for the things that I jump in and do, I think it's just being intentional about why I'm doing it and with the person why I'm doing it. So like I still take customer calls, I have customer emails.
Mm.
There's examples this weekend where we failed a customer in terms of how we responded to them from a customer support standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I was pushing on that, even though it's very tactical and the team knows, is not for that yes, for that specific customer, but more systematically to set a tone that like this is a process that needs to improve, and
Yeah.
this is a training that we need to give our team so we can do better in this specific situation.
Yeah. Yeah. When I used to work on Capitol Hill, I worked in DC right after college. And for every congressman believe, and still to this day, for every letter they get from a constituent about a topic,
Yeah.
100 1,000 constituents feel the same way.
Yeah, great
So
example.
that whatever gets to your desk from a customer feedback perspective,
Yeah,
you know that person represents a large number of
yeah,
customers.
great example.
We're about on time, so I want to ask you just one final question,
Okay.
which is, what is something that you've changed your mind about? What is like a long held belief that through learning, through someone's persuasion or influence, you changed your mind?
Oof. There are so many things I've changed my mind about. I'm trying to think of one that's consequential, that's not just like, because I think one of my superpowers and one of my weaknesses is as I've gotten better at listening, I will adapt my viewpoints sometimes too quickly and easily.
Hmm.
So there are a lot of examples that come to mind. What's something I've changed my mind about? Things in the crypto space that are coming to mind, but that's not very.
How
Um,
about with your people?
yeah,
Maybe change your mind about someone,
yeah,
earned your respect, they kind of turned the corner.
yeah, definitely examples of that. Um, Maybe I'm just an eternal optimist, but this isn't exactly changing my mind about people. Um I think one, people are inherently good, especially if they have the psychological safety to be authentic. People have
Yeah.
like long lived experiences that may create a lot of hatred, negativity, strange ways of reacting. But I
Mhm.
think people are inherently good. I see that in like young children as an example.
Sure.
Uh, and I think that uh, the thing that I've probably changed my mind about are people who I really thought were like not good at all in certain areas.
Mhm.
And as I said earlier, it's not just true in the CEO seat. It's like people just need to be pointed towards their strengths in a way that they can be themselves,
Yeah.
and goodness will flourish. And so I think I have like, I think that, I don't know if it's changed my mind, but I think I've gone from like other than people being good,
Mhm.
it's not like this like blanket statement of like, oh, that person's a good performer or bad performer, or like it's more about, are they pointed towards their strengths? And sometimes that's not at Remitly because of the stage size, roles we have. Sometimes it is, but I think that that's probably the area that I'm less binary when it comes to people, and more contextualize why they're behaving in a certain way,
Mhm.
and why they're performing in a certain way based on the role, context, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. People are inherently good. We all need this reminder, right? Brianna just put that into the chat. And I think you're right. A lot of CEOs pride themselves on thinking they're very quick judges of character. I can tell in 5 minutes if someone's going to work out here, right?
Yeah.
And that really fast thinking and black and white thinking can often get us into trouble, right? I like to say roses don't bloom in the desert. So sometimes what you're perceiving as an underperformance is simply the person's not in the right position, they're not supported in the right way, it's not the right working environment for them.
Yep.
And
Yep.
we can change just a few simple levers and suddenly this person's a rock star.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Matt, on
Exactly.
that note, I think we're going to have to end. I want to respect your time and the time of everyone who's dialed in. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks to the VC platform team, to Josh and Brianna. And until next time,
Thanks, Edward. Thanks, everybody. See ya.
bye bye.